Well, Governor Kathy Hochul with the state and the national Democratic parties think that the path to turning the U.S. House blue runs through central New York. Our viewership area includes 2 of their target districts, and they've raised $5 million and will soon field 80 staff people statewide and set up 35 new offices, and that includes ones in Utica, Auburn, Ithaca, North Syracuse, and Cazenovia. Both Congressional District 19, that stretches from around Ithaca east and south, and then District 22 surrounding Syracuse, both of those districts will be getting people and money. And so, Nina, how should they be spending that money?
Well, when you consider the fact that the average congressional district has just north of 761,000 voters, the traditional methods of going door to door and yard signs are really not going to cut it, and they haven't for some time. So in terms of campaign expenditures, it'll be important to focus on what most other congressional candidates focus on, and that is advertising first and foremost, and then secondarily, things like consulting, polling, to have a sense of how to craft one's message. In addition to that, it will be important to craft a message that has specific importance for upstate. Upstate's issues are very different from the rest of New York State, and they include, first and foremost, the opioid crisis, specifically fentanyl, because roughly 81% of folks who live upstate say that it is a serious problem, specifically within their own area. Second to that is job growth, because in the state of New York, 90% of the job growth does not happen upstate, but rather downstate. And a recent poll of business leaders in upstate pointed out that business conditions have worsened. They've always been worse as compared to downstate, but they've worsened. So I'd say that and also, of course, the agricultural industry, which sets upstate apart from downstate. So focusing on what matters to upstate, which is not going to be the cultural issues. I don't think the abortion issue is going to resonate as much as elsewhere, nor will the transgender issues or DEI.
Jenny, what about social media? How will that play in these districts?
So it's a great question, because social typically is more national focused typically, right? So there's the nature of social media is high level, visible, things that everybody can see, everybody experiences. So the presidential gets a lot of attention, but the down ballot races on social are a little bit less effective. And so something that Nina said I wanted to piggyback on, which is that the ground game can matter. So Brandon Williams was successful at the surprise win 2 years ago in the 22nd because he was incredibly effective at going door to door. He was in every little parade in every regional town. He did a lot of door knocking. He had volunteers. He was also, of course, spending a lot of money on ads and doing all that work to mobilize supporters. But the ground game still matters, and I think that's part of the calculus that we're seeing from the state is let's get people in the communities, in these little field offices, talking to neighbors, talking to friends. That's as impactful, if not more impactful, than the TV ads or the social media.
I gotta tell you, and this is to reinforce what you're saying, but also supplement what I said before. I attended a church service where Brandon Williams came and spoke, and it is a predominantly Black church. And I got to tell you, I was really struck by the sort of sincerity of the remarks that he had to offer, because I didn't know much about him and haven't followed him. But just that short encounter, I was thinking, okay, he's an interesting person.
That's interesting, because I've heard that one of his faults in the last couple of years has been that he hasn't been really showing up to much, right? And I think it's just probably recently that he's trying to up his appearances because he hasn't really spent much time. That's from what I've heard. But I mean, I think the larger question is here, sort of underlying all this, is how much does money really make a difference in these campaigns and the campaign spending? And $5 million isn't a lot of money in the larger scheme of things, but that doesn't mean it can't make a difference. And the political science literature is difficult to sort of tease out how much campaign spending really affects votes and voter and outcomes. But there's a recent study that I think did a really nice job of trying to tease a little bit of that out. What they find is that spending on advertisement and events does make a difference, but it doesn't persuade people to switch votes. Instead, it sort of changes the composition of the electorate. And essentially what it does is it discourages voters who would vote for your opponent to actually going out and voting. So my guess, and they don't talk about why that might be the case, but my guess is that's because it's of negative advertising and sort of depresses the vote on your opponent. And when you have margins of like 1%, which is what it was in the New York 22, that can make a really difference who shows up. You know, if people aren't showing up to vote on one side, that's going to make a big difference.
Tara, what about the impact of Harris at the top of the ticket now? Will that create more enthusiasm here?
You know, it's hard to say, because on the one hand, it will create more enthusiasm on the part of young people. Certainly, I think young African Americans, young females, I think it creates more enthusiasm on their part. I think, though, and this gets back to some of the points that the rest of the panelists have made, is that it may or may not help with more traditional voters, older voters who are going to look at Harris. They're probably going to focus much more on her record experience in terms of, as a prosecutor, where does she stand on support for the police, where does she stand on immigration. They're going to focus more on those bigger issues, as well as the economic my pocket issues. One other thing I wanted to point out in terms of that 5 million effort and the 80 staff, a lot's going to depend on where those people are coming from as well. If those folks are coming from outside the community, that's also going to have an impact, because you're much more likely to listen to someone who knows your community, is a part of your community, than you are someone who's coming from outside in, who you might be a little more suspicious of, or say, well, you know, it's nice that you're here, but you don't really know what I'm experiencing.
Good. Well, we've mentioned the New York 22, and I don't want to forget the other targeted district is New York 19, in which Josh Riley is the Democratic candidate running against Mark Molinaro.